Open houses can be a double-edged sword in the home selling process. They provide enhanced visibility and create a relaxed atmosphere for potential buyers. However, they also come with certain risks, including the chance of attracting unqualified visitors, potential security concerns, and reduced one-on-one interaction with serious buyers.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Why are we looking at this slide here where we're talking about the National Association of Realtor lawsuit settlement, which was finalized in 2024? I mean, that's not that long ago. We're talking $418 million payout. So the settlement basically dictates that as realtors, we can no longer publicly publish what we're offering the buyer agent in compensation or commission. So we can no longer put that percentage in the MLS. It is no longer allowed to do that. The other thing is, if you are a buyer and you're wanting to go look at property, you're either going to end up calling the listing agent who is representing the seller, or you're going to end up hiring your own agent. And when you do that, we now have a requirement that you sign a buyer rep agreement, which dictates how we get paid. And if we don't get paid from the seller, the that the buyer will cover that amount. So it's really important that you understand that, because buyer rep agreements are mandatory now, but they are not mandatory for open houses, which is why we're talking about this. So the listing agent who is representing the seller is obviously in contract with the seller and has already got a commission amount agreed on in writing from the seller. And that agreement either says that they agree to share a portion of the commission with the buyer agent broker or not. So, because of this lawsuit settlement, now the buyer agent broker commission is sometimes it's shared with the listing agent, again, who's being paid from the seller. Sometimes it's not offered at all. And so the listing agent will literally offer 0% or zero amount to the buyer broker. And the seller is still paying the listing agent. They've agreed to that, but in their agreement, they've agreed to not offer anything to the buyer agent. Sometimes it's negotiated in the offer. So in the contract, the buyer will actually dictate that the seller pay X amount for the buyer agent commission. So that is a possibility. And then the last option here is if the listing agent and the seller are not willing to offer anything to the buyer agent, now the buyer will be responsible for covering the difference and bringing that amount of additional money to the closing table. So it's really important to understand that, and also know that open houses do not require a buyer rep agreement, so anyone can show up. So, in addition to all of that, we now also have to deal with how realtors are getting paid when it comes to the listing agent. So on example A, this would be a regular old, how you know it from the past, and it's always been done like this. Literally, the seller pays the full amount of commission to the listing broker, and then the listing broker shares an amount with the buyer broker. Now, this isn't always split evenly, and that's what the public needs to understand. Sometimes sellers are hiring example A brokers and not actually realizing that in the paperwork they're paying the listing broker 6%, but in the paperwork it may say that they're offering 2% to the buyer broker. So that's some of the things that are happening right now behind the scenes that the public doesn't really grasp yet. So now, because of the settlement, we also have seller or listing brokers that are offering this model for commission payouts. Essentially, the listing agent is paid directly from the seller on example B, but the buyer broker, because no commission is being offered, when the offer is submitted to the seller in the contract, they will put X amount of dollars to be paid to the buyer's broker directly from the seller. And that is what's happening as well. And personally, I, from selling real estate since 2004, feel like in the future, all the transactions are going to end up being like example B. But right now in 2025, most of the transactions are still like example A. The problem lies in dual agency, when some brokers on example A, most of the brokers that are doing example A will allow dual agency, and most of the brokers on example B, some of them are doing dual agency and some of them aren't. And dual agency is a slippery slope because you're literally working with the buyer and the seller. And you are not supposed to advise either party. You're just basically a paper pusher and pushing paper until everything's signed. So I really don't like doing dual agency. And in fact, my current broker does not allow dual agency. So also in regarding example A, if a unrepresented buyer comes along and wants to work an offer with the seller through the listing agent, what would end up happening is the listing agent would earn the full percentage of the commission that is in the contract that they've signed in their listing agreement paperwork. Some of the times, the public feel like if we go directly to the listing broker, we'll save that amount of percentage that they would have earned. And that is most of the time absolutely not true. The listing broker in example A will earn the full commission amount, period, 99% of the time. There would need to be special verbiage or a special paragraph put into the contract that we have available to us as realtors from the Texas Real Estate Commission. These are promulgated forms that we can only edit blanks. And most of the brokers that are using this model on example A are getting paid the full commission amount when an unrepresented buyer purchases the property. If you're working with your realtor and your realtor's telling you that you're in a seller's market, then you would definitely be interested in doing open houses because there's a high demand for property anyway. In a seller's market, we have multiple offers and buyers paying over asking sometimes for property. The demand is high. So the doing the open house would be very beneficial in the beginning of the listing period for high traffic days and multiple offers. So that would be beneficial if we're in a seller's market to do an open house. However, if we are dealing with a buyer's market, we're dealing with a completely different animal. And doing an open house in a buyer's market may not have the same type of results that you may have expected. And regarding the buyers that come through the property as well, we have to be aware of the situation that anyone can come through. So if we're dealing with a buyer's market, you may want to reconsider doing an open house, especially multiple open houses. An initial open house in the beginning of the listing period is totally okay. However, doing multiple open houses in a buyer's market really projects the wrong message to the public of what we're trying to accomplish, because most of the time they see the multiple open houses and our days on market are adding up, and we need to be careful because the public perceives our house as, why is it not selling? What's wrong with the house? And in reality, there's nothing wrong with the house. The market has shifted and it's now a buyer's market. And so when there's too much for sale, too much inventory, prices do adjust down. And so some sellers may not want to accept that, but in reality, that's the situation. And by doing multiple open houses, it does hurt the overall outcome of the property. So you may want to reconsider it if you're in a buyer's market. One is okay, one or two is okay, but more than that, it really sends the wrong message.
Okay, so when we put the house on the market and we start showing the property, we're going to be able to track the amount of buyers that are going through the property versus if we do an open house. Now we have the open house traffic, but it kind of clouds our knowledge of actual requested showings, one-on-one showings versus the open house, if that makes sense. And when we are talking about pricing, we need to factor in how much traffic we're getting. If we're getting 2 to 4 showings a week, that's the ideal target where we want to target. And that would be the market telling you that you are priced market. And this is the market activity that you're going to get is 2 to 4 showings. If we're not getting the 2 to 4 showings, then we are overpriced. The market is telling us that we are overpriced. If we are getting over 2 to 4 showings, then we are in the market, and that's exactly where we want to be. So we want to be showing the property, but we don't want to be trapped in what we call no man's land. And in no man's land, we are somewhere between market and out of market in terms of pricing. And the property does show sporadically, but we aren't getting offers and we aren't getting second showings and we aren't getting people that are in the property for an hour or more. And we aren't getting questions asked by the buyer at all. So it's important to recognize where you fall when you are selling the property and deciding if you should or should not do an open house or an additional multiple open house uh, or not. So I created this timeline here for you to kind of grasp the reality of the different strategies and marketing concepts that realtors have done for since the beginning of ages. And you can go all the way back to 200 to 1980 here and see that, of course, we were doing open houses. We had in the yard and also broker opens and public open houses as well. And then in 1985, the MLS was created, and that was the multiple listing service. And now the public and realtors alike all had one place to go to find properties for their clients and also sell properties through the multiple listing service.
1990, we basically have the birth of the internet. We have the internet, the MLS now on the internet, which makes it much easier to find property as well. And the addition of the QR code, which was invented in 1994, but some agents really didn't start using them until the 2000s. And then I had one of these devices that you record a description about the property on an audio. It was a receiver that would broadcast audio if you tuned into a AM station. And so we would have flyers and rider signs on the side telling people to tune in, and they would drive by the property, tune in, and listen to the description of the property. Yes, that was a thing, and I did that for properties and sold properties that way. Um, and then in 2004, we had Facebook, which was created, and YouTube right after that. And also in the 2000s, we went from literally 1 to 15 photos to now 25 photos. 2010, we get Instagram. Also, to mention, in the 2000s, we had the foreclosure era, which was high inventory and lots of foreclosures. And then 2010, we had Instagram. The foreclosures started to slow down. And then the invention of the 3D tour, which was really a groundbreaking thing for real estate sales. 2016, of course, TikTok, we can't forget that. And now we're still at 25 photos on the MLS and the internet. 2020 hits, and lots of MLSs increased their photo counts to 40. And now, in also, we obviously had COVID, which really catapulted the virtual tours, especially the 3D virtual tours. There's one thing to have a slideshow, and there's a totally different thing to have a 360-degree walk through the entire property type experience. And now in 2025, we've increased photos up to 50, but by doing that many photos of a regular type property, it almost is overkill. And some MLSs even now have up to 99 photos, which I hope that your property is a mansion, because that's what will work with that. Other than that, it's just overkill. So. So the 3D tours are here to stay. We're not going away. They're definitely a very important tool into the online marketing of the selling of your home. Without the virtual tour, you can still sell a property, but with the virtual tour, it really cuts out all of the people that are not interested in the property, because they can literally walk through the property virtually. And in fact, some of these virtual tours will work with the VR goggles like you see here on the screen. And you literally stare at a spot and you walk to that spot. You turn around, stare at another spot, and then you walk to that spot. So you literally can virtually walk through the entire property. You can also do that on your phone as well. And these are literally a virtual open house online 24/7. And anyone that wants to look at the property in person obviously can contact the listing agent and view the property. It's an open house, and the ability to get a real person to come through the property as well by marketing it through the virtual tour. So, in a nutshell, there's literally, basically, if you consider it and really think about it, there's really only two types of buyers. We have looky-loo buyers, and then we have bona fide buyers. So let's take a look at that a little bit closer. And then, regarding the characteristics of the looky-loo buyer, let's take a look at that. I mean, more or less, we have some that are more or less just curious. We also have some buyers, believe it or not, that really enjoy looking at property, and they go around with their friends or family members and make it a social event, believe it or not. And we also have looky loos that are just more or less curious about the prices in the area, but they're not serious buyers. We also have the looky loos that are just not there financially, but they would love to be there. And then we have the just looking looky loo. And these are the looky loos that really avoid any confrontation with the person at the open house. And then we have the habitual open house buyer or looky loo. These are the looky loos that go to open houses literally every single weekend, and it is part of their what they do every weekend. Well, once we get to the part where we move all of the looky loo buyers out of the picture and we determine that our buyer is not a looky loo, but they're an actual buyer, we now can categorize these buyers in one of these categories. We have the completely not qualified at all. They're not working with a real estate agent. And in fact, they're almost a looky loo, but they're basically a buyer, a future buyer, just really too early in on the process. Can they be converted into a buyer? Yes, they can, but most of the time, it's their timeline that doesn't work with your for now house for sale publicly now. So usually these buyers are just not quite ready. Then we have the completely totally qualified, but they're not working with a real estate agent. That those buyers are awesome and they are out there. Then we have a completely not qualified buyer working with a real estate agent. Yes, real estate agents are independent contractors. They determine who they work with. I'll leave it at that. Then we have the totally qualified buyer, which is working with a real estate agent, and that would be great because we know they're qualified. We have a approval letter that says that we can contact the lender, ask any questions, etc. And they're working with a real estate agent, which means we're not going to have to deal with questions. And if the real estate agent is asking for a commission, it will be in their offer or also be offered by the listing agent, depending on how the contract was written when the listing was created.
Okay, so let's talk about the pros and cons finally about doing an open house. Of course, overall, yes, open houses are worth it to do an open house right in the initial phase of the listing going live. Of course, you'll have increased exposure, and also have potential buyers who may not have otherwise considered the property. It's a low pressure environment. Buyers can walk in and go in their own pace without pressure of a scheduled appointment. The A lot of times in the open houses, there's networking opportunities, and in fact, I get people that come into open houses trying to sell me stuff as well. So believe it or not, that happens. And we, in doing the open house, one of the pros is we get immediate feedback on the property, and then typically, again, it's usually in the beginning of the stage of putting up the house for sale, so we can modify our whatever we need to right at the beginning and get that upfront feedback from a good open house. And if there's multiple people in the property, it can create a sense of urgency with serious buyers if they are at the open house. So those are all the pros. In terms of the cons, we obviously attract uninvited guests. And of course, believe it or not, yes, theft and vandalism can happen in an open house. We, of course, the house is open, so unqualified buyers and looky loos are obviously going to come through the property, as well as your neighbors, your nosy neighbors, and um, anyone driving by. Um,
In terms of the cons on the open house versus a private showing, I, we're only one person in the property typically, and we can't be on all of, if there's multiple groups in the same house, we can't be one on one with everyone. So that's the biggest con, in my opinion, is the less one on one, especially if there's multiple people in the house. And open houses just more or less can be somewhat of a disappointment, and especially if we get no one, if we get a big old goose egg. So that's a huge disappointment. It is inconvenient for occupied properties. Anyone that has to pack up their animals, vacate the property for the open house. And then one con as a seller to consider is you need to realize that the agents that are hosting the open house, of course, they're trying to sell your property, but if they can't sell your property, they can sell another property that would match the buyer's criteria. So that's the biggest, one of the other things that we need to consider when we're looking at the pros and cons of doing an open house. So just to understand that, of course, the agent that's hosting the open house would love to sell the property. However, if they can't sell your property, they can sell another property that would match the buyer's criteria. And this sometimes, if you think about it from a seller perspective, is this a beneficial thing? It's just part of the package. If we could sell your house and the buyer loves your property, of course we'll do that. If not, though, if they mention that they want a bigger backyard or a bigger pantry or an open layout, there's plenty of other properties that could match their criteria. And if they're unrepresented, now the agent has an opportunity to procure a new buyer, have them under contract in a buyer rep agreement, and start working with them to find the property that they want. So that is the job of a real estate agent, is to sell real estate in whatever way they can. So please understand that. And most agents that are hosting open houses are hoping to get more business in one way or another. They're not being paid typically by the hour from anyone. The sellers hired them to sell the house, and most of the time, the agent will do an initial open house in the beginning of the listing phase. If there's a decent price drop, then of course another open house would be beneficial right after the price drop that following weekend. But beyond that, multiple open houses in a buyer's market will affect the house in a negative aspect, in my opinion. So regarding who is hosting the open house, it's typically the listing agent or a junior team member or another agent on the broker. And again, if we can't sell that house or your house that we're hosting the open house in, we can sell another house that would work. Or it could also be another agent that the listing agent is paying out of their pocket to be there. Yes, that could happen as well. And those are licensed realtors as well. And again, if they can't sell your house, they can sell another house that would work. So their objective is to sell property, yours or another house. It's the same to them. The faster, the better is their mantra. So, and again, just to kind of keep in up to date, some sellers may or may not be offering a agent broker compensation. So that's important to keep in mind. It's important to keep in mind that whether we do an open house or not is one thing, but if there is a buyer that wants to see the house, having a one-on-one tour versus an open house is a much more desirable option as a real estate agent. Speaking as a real estate agent since 2004, a private tour, I'm going to be able to really point out all of the benefits the house has to offer versus an open house where I'm often distracted by other people in the open house. Um, and I'm just not able to have a focused one on one that I would if it's a private showing. I know that maybe weird to hear, but it is true. A private showing is a much better option. Another thing to consider, especially if we're talking your house is now in a buyer's market and we're not talking a seller's market. If we're dealing with a buyer's market and there are multiple homes for sale within a half-mile radius and multiple open houses going on, it definitely indicates a struggle for demand for those homes to sell. And it projects not the greatest message that we're trying to portray. So if you see the same house doing multiple open houses, the buyers are going to think, what's wrong with the house? Why isn't it selling? Why are they doing an open house again and multiple open houses over and over and over? Just remember that if a buyer really wants to see the property, they will make an effort to see the property, and that typically means contacting the listing agent directly to view the property. So that's how it most of the time happens. So whether you do an open house or not, just remember that if the buyer wants to see the house, we will do everything we can to get them into the property to see it. I can assure you of that. I appreciate your time today, and it's important to factor out and to figure out where you actually stand when it comes to doing an open house. And should you do an open house or should you actually not do an open house, and determining what type of market your property is in. And once you know what kind of either if your house is in a buyer's market or a seller's market, and also what other homes around you are doing, then it's after you take all of those things into consideration, then you decide, should you do an open house or not? And sometimes it's beneficial to do an open house. And then also, by the same token, sometimes doing an open house or too many open houses can actually hurt the listing. And that is the message that I want to bring to you today. And I hope that it was helpful. And if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm your local real estate agent, and I've been selling real estate in the area since 2004, and I'd love to help you as well. Thanks again, and I appreciate your time.